Brothers and sisters, something is happening across Africa, something powerful, something unstoppable. For decades, the continent was silenced, its people told what to do, what to think, and even what to dream by forces thousands of miles away. But today, that silence is breaking. From the dusty plains of Burkina Faso to the heart of the Sahel, a new voice is rising, firm, fearless, and full of purpose. The world is calling it Africa's silent revolution. And at the front of this storm stands a man who refuses to kneel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For generations, Western powers dictated Africa's destiny through aid, loans, and fear. They built systems not for Africa's growth, but for Africa's dependence. Every development project had a hidden price. Every investment carried invisible chains. And for years, Africa's leaders bowed their heads, signing deals they didn't read, accepting conditions they didn't write. But Traoré looked at this long, painful history and said, "Enough. The age of control is over. The age of African sovereignty begins now." He didn't shout this in secret chambers or fancy conferences. He stood before his people under the blazing Burkina Faso sun and declared, "Brothers and sisters, our freedom will never come from those who once enslaved us. It will come from us, the children of Africa, standing together, defending our soil, our gold, and our dignity." And with that, something shifted. Across Africa, from Mali to Niger, from Guinea to Chad, his words became sparks. The young began to speak louder. Soldiers began to question their orders. Even governments began to reconsider their alliances. This was not just politics, this was awakening. When Traoré took power, the Western analysts laughed. They called him too young, too emotional, too unpredictable. But within months, they stopped laughing. Why? Because this young captain did what few before him dared to do. He cut off the strings. He ordered the withdrawal of foreign troops who claimed to be there for peacekeeping, but who often brought chaos. He rejected aid packages that came with impossible conditions. He expelled NGOs that treated Africans like children. Instead, he said something that echoed across the continent. If we can fight for our land, we can build it ourselves. If we can bleed for our country, we can feed it ourselves. The crowd roared. For the first time in years, the people of Burkina Faso saw not a puppet, but a leader who spoke their truth. Behind the scenes, the Western capitals began to panic. Reports started circulating in Washington, Paris, and Brussels, all asking the same question: what is happening in West Africa? The answer was simple: Africa was finally waking up. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was powerful. Farmers began organizing cooperatives that no longer depended on Western aid. Local engineers began designing energy systems using African minerals. Small gold mining towns began talking about refining their gold in Africa instead of shipping it to Europe. And at the center of it all, Traoré was meeting leaders across the Sahel, whispering one simple message: the future of Africa will be built by Africans. One day, during a speech that would later go viral across the continent, Traoré stood on stage and asked, "How can a continent so rich be called poor? How can we have gold, uranium, diamonds, and yet our children go hungry? The problem is not the land, the problem is the system." He was right. For decades, the system was designed to extract wealth, not build it, to weaken, not strengthen. And when a young leader dares to question it, he becomes an enemy. Soon after, intelligence agencies began sending reports of instability in Burkina Faso. Western news outlets began running stories labeling Traoré as radical, authoritarian, even dangerous. But the people, they saw something else. They saw courage. They saw a man who refused to sell his country's future for Western approval. Burkina Faso became the symbol of something much bigger than itself. A revolution not of guns, but of minds. A revolution that didn't seek permission. Mali, Niger, Guinea all began to echo Traoré's message. Joint statements were signed. Borders were secured. Local industries were revived. Even students began writing to him, calling him the leader of a new Africa. But make no mistake, this revolution wasn't about one man. It was about millions of Africans who realized they didn't need validation from the West to know their worth. In quiet towns across Africa, murals of Traoré began appearing with words like sovereignty, pride, freedom. The same media that once mocked him now couldn't ignore him. Even Western diplomats admitted this man has changed the entire political equation of Africa. And the change wasn't just political, it was psychological. For the first time, young Africans began believing that they didn't have to flee to Europe to find success, that Africa could rise not through charity but through will. In one powerful interview, Traoré said, "We are not against the West, but we are against manipulation. We are against exploitation. If you come to Africa, come with respect, not chains." That one sentence became a rallying cry, chanted in markets, schools, and military camps. As months passed, Burkina Faso's transformation became impossible to ignore. Roads were being rebuilt using local labor. Schools were reopened in rural areas. The military, once fragmented, now stood united under one vision, the defense of sovereignty. But the most profound change wasn't in infrastructure. It was in identity. Africans began walking taller, speaking louder, dreaming bigger. And though Western media still refused to understand it, one truth had become clear. Africa's silent revolution had begun. And at its heart stood one man, not seeking fame, not chasing wealth, but leading a generation towards something greater than independence, true freedom. The world didn't see it coming. The rise of a generation that had been told for years, "You cannot stand alone." The same generation now walking into the streets with flags raised high, chanting the name of a young leader who dared to break the mold. Traoré, Traoré, Traoré. Burkina Faso was no longer following. It was leading. The same country once dismissed as one of Africa's poorest was now shaping a new African ideology, one that said sovereignty was not negotiable. And this ideology didn't come from political handbooks or economic theories. It came from the raw reality of a people who had nothing left to lose but their chains. When Traoré spoke at the African Youth Forum that year, every sentence hit like thunder. "We have waited too long for others to bring development to us. The time has come to build it ourselves. Africa is not a laboratory. Africa is a home, and its children will now defend it like one." The crowd exploded, but it wasn't just applause, it was awakening. Young men and women began to see themselves not as victims of history, but as builders of destiny. Universities began hosting debates on economic independence, and students carried his speeches printed on paper, quoting him word for word. But while Africa cheered, the West worried. In secret meetings in Paris, Washington, and Brussels, officials discussed what they called the Sahel shift. Reports warned that Burkina Faso's stance could inspire a domino effect, threatening Western influence across Africa. They were right. Within months, Mali, Niger, and Guinea joined Burkina Faso in declaring their intention to cut military ties with foreign powers and build a joint security alliance. They began meeting in Ouagadougou under what would later be called the Alliance of Sahel States. Traoré was no longer a national leader. He was becoming a continental symbol. Yet he didn't care for titles. He said in a private meeting later leaked online, "We don't want to be heroes. We just want to be free. Let freedom be our only victory." Those words swept through African social media like wildfire. Hashtags like Free Africa, Traoré Movement, and Sahel Rising began trending. Even African artists began composing songs inspired by his defiance. But the Western media tried to twist the story. They painted him as anti-democracy, anti-West, even a threat to stability. But what they didn't understand was that Africa had a different definition of democracy now, one that wasn't built in foreign embassies but in African hearts. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, things were changing rapidly. The government launched Project Independence 2030, a nationwide plan to build industries powered by African resources and African innovation. Traoré announced, "No more selling gold for pennies while buying bread for dollars. We will produce, refine, and trade on our own terms." That line, "on our own terms," became the foundation of his economic doctrine. Gold mines once run by European corporations were now being nationalized. Agreements that extracted resources but left nothing for locals were being cancelled. For the first time in decades, the profits stayed home, and while the West called it economic isolation, Africa called it reclamation. Burkina Faso also began building strong ties with nations outside the Western orbit: Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran, seeking technology and infrastructure instead of empty aid. Western analysts said it was risky. Traoré replied, "Risky for who? For those who used to control us. Africa will no longer ask permission to rise." At the same time, African soldiers across the Sahel began retraining, rebuilding, and rearming, not under foreign guidance but under African command. A new doctrine was born: Africa protects Africa. Western generals warned that this could destabilize regional balance. But in truth, what they feared was losing control. Then came the economic blow. Burkina Faso announced the creation of a West African Economic Sovereignty Fund, where member countries could contribute their gold reserves to back local currencies. It was the beginning of an independent financial system, free from the claws of the IMF and World Bank. It was revolutionary. When the IMF sent envoys to negotiate, Traoré refused to even meet them. Instead, he sent a statement that read, "Africa will no longer mortgage its children's future for loans it doesn't need. The world must respect that." That statement echoed through African capitals like a warning shot. Across the continent, economists began discussing a future where Africa could control its currency, trade directly, and stop bleeding wealth through debt interest and unfair trade deals. The more the West pushed back, the stronger the Sahel alliance became. And then something incredible happened. In a televised address, Traoré invited leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea to Ouagadougou, where they signed a mutual defense and economic solidarity pact. The sight of African leaders standing together, not under the flag of any superpower but under their own, shook the world. The African streets erupted. People danced, waved flags, and sang songs of unity. It wasn't just celebration, it was rebirth. In one emotional clip, an old Burkinabe farmer was seen crying and saying, "I never thought I'd live to see the day Africa stands up for itself." It went viral, millions shared it. Western news outlets tried to ignore it, but they couldn't. They began writing cautious headlines: "New power dynamics emerging in West Africa." Analysts on television debated whether Traoré's movement was a temporary rebellion or the beginning of a new African era. But for the people of Africa, the answer was clear. There was no going back, because once you taste freedom, dependence feels like poison. And in that moment, Africa's silent revolution stopped being silent. The sounds of drums, chants, and national anthems filled the air from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. This was no longer just Burkina Faso's story. This was Africa's story, and at the heart of it stood one man, steady, unyielding, and deeply rooted in his people's spirit: Ibrahim Traoré. He had done something the world thought was impossible: unite pride with purpose. But the question still lingered: how far would this revolution go before the world tried to stop it? Would the West stand by, or would it fight back to keep control of what it once ruled? Because history has shown one truth: when Africa begins to rise, the world starts to tremble. The drums of change were beating louder than ever, not just in Ouagadougou, but across the entire African continent. What had started as a whisper in the Sahel was now a roar echoing through global corridors of power. In Washington, the tone had shifted. What was once dismissed as a passing populist movement was now being labeled a strategic threat. Secret memos circulated in Pentagon briefings described Traoré as a destabilizing force challenging the post-war global order. In Paris, former colonial officials couldn't hide their panic. French media ran back-to-back debates on how Burkina Faso had fallen out of Europe's orbit. But in reality, it wasn't just Burkina Faso. It was the entire idea of African submission that was collapsing. The West had underestimated one simple truth: you can control a nation's wealth, you can even suppress its people for decades, but you cannot control the awakening of pride. And that awakening was now unstoppable. Inside Burkina Faso, Change wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Ordinary people began to walk differently, talk differently. The young generation no longer looked to Europe or America for inspiration. They looked to their own soil, their own leaders, their own courage. In villages across the Sahel, posters of Traoré hung beside those of Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, the fallen giants who had once dared to dream the same dream. Traoré himself paid tribute to them during one of his fiery national addresses. Standing before a massive crowd, he said, "They tried to bury our heroes, but they didn't know we were seeds. Today, those seeds have grown into forests of resistance." The roar that followed was thunderous, but in the background, shadows began to move. Intelligence reports started emerging. Western agents were meeting with former Burkina Faso officials in neighboring countries. There were whispers of covert operations, of plots to restore order, of media campaigns to paint Traoré as a dictator. Yet every attempt only made him stronger. When one Western outlet released a story claiming Traoré was building a militarized regime, his supporters responded with a viral hashtag, "Militarized for Freedom." The people had learned to fight propaganda with pride, but Traoré knew he was playing a dangerous game. His advisors warned him, "They will not let this stand. You are challenging not just countries, but systems built on African dependency." He nodded, calm as ever, and replied, "Then let them come. For once they will find Africa ready." That line would go down in history. Burkina Faso began strengthening its defenses, not just militarily, but economically and digitally. Traoré ordered the establishment of a cyber defense unit to counter Western misinformation and protect African narratives. At the same time, engineers and soldiers worked hand in hand on new local infrastructure projects, solar grids, training centers, and railways connecting remote provinces to the capital. Each project carried the same label, "Built by Burkina Faso hands." The people were no longer waiting for help. They were building their own future. Then, a major event shifted the global conversation once again. In a televised summit held in Niamey, Niger, the leaders of the Sahel Alliance stood side by side, Traoré, Gaïda, Tchani, and signed a document declaring economic independence from Western financial institutions. The declaration was broadcast live, and within hours it was trending across the world. African commentators called it the Second Independence. Western diplomats called it economic suicide. But for millions of Africans, it was liberation. Traoré spoke last that day, and his speech would become legendary. He looked into the cameras and said, "They said Africa would collapse without their aid. But aid is not help, it is a leash. And today, Africa cuts that leash once and for all." The hall erupted. People cried, clapped, and sang in celebration. But in Washington and Brussels, the mood was grim. Reports indicated that Western influence in West Africa was collapsing faster than expected. Investment projects were stalling. Military bases were under pressure to shut down. Africa was slipping away, and no one knew how to stop it. A classified memo from a Western intelligence agency read, "Traoré has become more than a political leader. He is a psychological weapon. His words spread faster than our policies." And it was true. Every speech, every statement from Traoré spread across Africa like wildfire, translated, shared, remixed into music videos, quoted in classrooms. He wasn't just leading Burkina Faso. He was reshaping what it meant to be African in the modern world. But he wasn't naive. He knew history. He had seen what happened to Sankara, to Gaddafi, to anyone who dared to stand against global interests. He once told his inner circle, "They can take my life, but they cannot kill the idea of freedom." Once an idea is born in the hearts of the people, it becomes immortal. Those words became a mantra for his supporters. In the following weeks, Burkina Faso's alliance expanded, with Guinea, Chad, and even parts of Central Africa showing interest in joining. A new African bloc was emerging, one that operated outside Western approval. Western leaders scrambled to respond, offering partnership reforms, aid restructuring, and dialogue forums. But the African youth saw through it all. They remembered the decades of empty promises. The aid, that came with hidden chains, and the development programs that never developed anything except dependency. And now they were done waiting. At universities, students organized debates with topics like, should Africa build its own IMF? And decolonizing our economy. Artists began painting murals of Traoré breaking chains, or holding Africa's map above flames. The revolution was not just political, it was cultural. Burkina Faso became the symbol of a new Africa, proud, self-reliant and unafraid. But as Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace one evening, looking over the horizon, his expression was somber. His advisor asked, "What's wrong, Captain? We are winning." Traoré replied quietly, "Winning is the easy part. Keeping the victory alive, that's the real battle." Because he knew the West would not surrender its grip easily. Already, intelligence reports hinted at new plans, trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation, and covert funding of opposition groups. The storm was gathering again, and in the calm before it, Traoré made one last promise to his people. "If the price of freedom is hardship, then let us pay it proudly. Because the chains we break today will save our children tomorrow." The crowd answered with a roar that shook the capital. And from that moment it was clear. This was no longer just politics. This was Africa's rebirth. The storm that had been brewing finally began to thunder. Within weeks of Traoré's declaration of total independence, Western governments began coordinating behind closed doors. Confidential cables between Washington, Paris, and Brussels painted a grim picture. Africa was slipping from their control faster than anyone had predicted. France's influence had already crumbled. The United States, meanwhile, was panicking over its shrinking presence in the Sahel. As one American defense report put it, "If we lose West Africa, we lose our foothold in the heart of the continent. The domino effect will be unstoppable." And unstoppable it was. Traoré's words had spread far beyond Burkina Faso. From Senegal to South Africa, his speeches were being quoted, remixed into songs, and played on street corners. Youth leaders began calling their movements the Traoré generation. Everywhere, Africans were rising, not with weapons but with awareness. Meanwhile, Traoré was not celebrating. He was planning. In his dimly lit office late one night, maps of Africa stretched across the table, red marks drawn around ports, trade routes, and key energy zones. His military advisors spoke of defense coordination, while his economic team discussed a new continental currency, one that would be African by creation, African by control, and African by destiny. The captain sat silently for a moment, then said, "They enslaved us through gold, they controlled us through paper. Now we'll buy our freedom with both." It was a statement that would go down in history, but the response from the West was fierce. Sanctions were whispered about. Aid packages were frozen. Western media began pushing headlines like, "Burkina Faso on the brink. Is Traoré leading Africa into isolation?" And yet, every negative story only fueled the movement. Ordinary Africans saw the bias, the fear behind the coverage, and they rallied even harder. When Western journalists mocked Traoré for wearing his military uniform instead of a suit, supporters flooded social media with messages like, "We'd rather follow a soldier who protects us than a politician who sells us." Every insult became ammunition. Every doubt became strength. Then came the turning point, a shocking revelation that shattered diplomatic silence. A leaked internal document from a Western intelligence agency outlined plans to undermine popular confidence in the Sahel leadership through coordinated disinformation and economic pressure. The leak went viral. People were furious. For decades, they had been told the West only wanted partnership and democracy. Now the truth was out. Manipulation had always been the real game. Traoré addressed the nation that evening in a televised broadcast. Standing before the Burkina Faso flag, his voice calm yet heavy, he said, "They say they come to teach us democracy, but what they teach is obedience. They say they give aid, but what they give are chains. Well, my brothers and sisters, we are done learning their lessons." The crowd outside the palace roared, flags waved, drums pounded in the night air. "Today," Traoré continued, We take our own exam and Africa will pass it together. The next morning, a convoy of trucks began rolling across Burkina Faso, carrying supplies, medicine, and building materials to remote regions. The message was simple: the state takes care of its own. At the same time, news came from Mali. Assimi Goïta had announced joint training and economic programs with Burkina Faso and Niger, calling it the Sahel-Alliance of Independence. 3 countries, 1 voice, 1 vision. Western leaders dismissed it as symbolic, but the people knew symbols have power. And that power was growing. In African capitals, murals began appearing, a map of the continent wrapped in golden light, with the words, "The new dawn belongs to us." Artists painted, poets wrote, farmers worked longer hours not out of duty but out of pride. The continent was waking up, just as Traoré had dreamed. But even as hope soared, Traoré remained grounded. He told his ministers, "We are building something fragile. The world will try to break it, so let our unity be stronger than their money." And indeed, unity became their shield. When rumors of sabotage surfaced, attacks on local industries, cyber strikes on state networks, neighboring nations offered immediate help. Africa was protecting Africa. The West didn't understand it. For so long, they had treated African countries as isolated pieces on a chessboard. Now, those pieces were moving together not as pawns, but as a force. The domino effect had begun. In Ghana, students marched with placards that read, "We want our own Traoré." In Kenya, journalists held public forums on African economic liberation. And in South Africa, an entire conference was dedicated to the Sahel model of sovereignty. It was no longer about Burkina Faso. It was about every African nation reclaiming its dignity. Then came the most symbolic moment of all. On Independence Day, Traoré stood at the main square in Ouagadougou. The sun was setting behind him as thousands filled the streets. In his hand, he held a piece of paper, the original document of Burkina Faso's military pact with the West. Without saying a word, he tore it in half. The crowd erupted. "This," he shouted, "is the day Africa's spine stands straight again." Fireworks lit the sky. Drums thundered. The moment was electric, the kind that children would tell their grandchildren about decades later. As the celebrations echoed through the night, cameras captured something few noticed in the noise: Traoré stepping back from the podium, looking toward the horizon with quiet determination. A journalist nearby caught his final words before he turned away. "We've started a fire they can't put out." And he was right. Across the world, people watched, some with fear, some with admiration, some with hope. But one thing was certain: Africa would never be the same again. The era of silence was over. The age of independence had begun. And as the screen fades to black, the narrator's voice returns one last time, calm, confident, resonant. If you believe Africa deserves its own destiny, if you believe stories like this must be told, then don't just watch, be part of the movement. Hit subscribe, share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice rise once more. Because this is just the beginning.